Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. We have gathered today to commemorate the Bahraini Martyrs Day, which is taking place tomorrow, and that's why we have today our event: Modern Martyrs, Extrajudicial Killings and Executions by the Bahraini Authorities. We're going to begin by giving some context on the reality of extrajudicial killings and the death penalty in Bahrain happening right now. So first of all, the government of Bahrain continues to resort to violence to quell political dissent. It's been doing that for decades. In 2015, human rights organizations have documented dozens of extrajudicial killings, both directly and indirectly attributable to Bahraini security forces. One of the key recommendations of the third cycle Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights, and I quote here, was to hold officials of all ranks accountable for their actions, especially regarding allegation of killings, torture, and other ill treatment accountable. The Bahraini government has not only failed to bring those potentially implicated before court, but also failed to remove them from positions of power. The Special Investigations Unit, the SIU, of Bahraini's Public Prosecution Office, which is tasked with investigating the Bahraini officials involved in unlawful killings, torture, and other human rights violations, has produced convictions only on 2 cases. The officers responsible for the deaths of Abdul Karim Fakrawi and Syed Mahmoud, caused by torture and shooting respectively, were charged with an initial sentence which was later reduced following an appeal to mere 3 and 2 years imprisonment. Perpetrators of extrajudicial killings remain at large. Therefore, today at our event, we would like to, first having introduced the topic, we'd like to introduce our panel, which will discuss the issue surrounded by extrajudicial killings. So first of all, we have Professor Mark Owen Jones, Assistant Professor in Middle East Studies at the Hamad bin Khalifa University. With us today, Rodney Shakespeare, the Chair of the Committee Against Torture in Bahrain. Thank you for being with us today. Agnesi Bafano, the Research and Policy Associate at the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy, short and bird. And finally, Professor Stacey Strobel, Professor at Shenandoah University in Criminology and Criminal Justice. Thank you all for being with us today. Just to explain the format today, each speaker will give us a presentation and their take on extrajudicial killings and the death penalty in Bahrain, which would in turn follow with a Q&A session. You can, we want to have the questions posted towards the end of the event, so I will give you a sign when you can post those in the chat within the Zoom meeting. It would be great if you could address those to a specific panelist. It would make it just a bit easier and more organized when answering questions. So before we begin with the panel, I'll leave the floor to our host, Frankie Malloy, the Sinn Féin MP from Mid-Ulster since 2013. We are grateful for your continued cooperation with ECDHR, and again, many thanks for accepting to speak today.
First of all, good evening, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to address your open your Martyrs Day panel discussion. We have always been glad to facilitate public meetings for the Bahraini comrades in Westminster, but unfortunately, due to the circumstances of COVID and the closing down of Westminster basically for public meetings, we can't meet in person this time, but we are glad to host this event. However, the wonders of technology, it actually is good to kick things off in this way and at least bring people onto the one screen and join people together in that way. And I have to leave to do another meeting with the Good Friday Agreement Committee, which is an All-Ireland body based in the Dáil in Ireland. So I will leave you then in the capable hands of the panel of speakers. As Irish Republicans, I'm honoured to join with you today and to remember and honour your martyrs. And our martyrs are all the same people. In Ireland, we understand the importance of honouring one's patriot dead. The great Irish patriot Padraig Pearse, who was signatory to the Proclamation of 1916, said in 1915 that the British were fools because they left us with our Fenian dead, the previous generation. And he stated that while Ireland held these graves, Ireland unfree would never be at peace. On behalf of my party, Sinn Féin, I wish to extend our continued solidarity and support to and call for justice, rule of law, and for the people's right to self-rule in Bahrain. It's not surprising for us to hear of the British government officials have consistently ignored reports of human rights abuses in Bahrain. And it's all too familiar story for ourselves. Unfortunately, we're still struggling to get the British to live up to the human rights abuses and to acknowledge them and to deal with them that happened during the conflict. This week we've had some success on the lines that those who were tortured during the internment, they actually have got the Supreme Court in Britain to actually say that the PSNI were wrong not to fully investigate their torture and ill treatment in the proper way. And also this week we actually had the Miami show band who were murdered, 3 of them murdered by the loyalists and British forces in collusion, a show band who were going about their business of entertainment, and their van was actually hijacked and the legal checkpoint, and a bomb put in their van which blew up, and the rest of them were shot. So this week they got justice as well, in that they have been some of them compensated for but it's 46 years ago since that happened, and so the amounts of money that they got in compensation go a very short way in actually any way of compensation for what actually did happen at that particular time. And also we hear at the present time the British government trying to bring in an amnesty for the British forces, and to cloak that over, they're basically saying there will be an amnesty for everyone, no further investigations, no inquests, no judicial system, basically close down the system, because it's now coming to a stage that they can't answer for the injustices that actually happened, for the torture that happened, and for some of the things that happened in their prisons, like the Long Kesh concentration camp. I would particularly like to cite the issue of your own experience of the Bahraini security forces, the use of rubber bullets, plastic bullets, the tear gas, and the deadly crippling weapons that they have used over the years. The same as what was utilised by the British forces in the North of Ireland here, where a number of people were severely maimed by these, and particularly, to cite the case of the 17-year-old Mohammed Al-Dir, who on the 22nd of February 2012 was shot directly in the face from less than 15 meters by a tear gas canister. And basically, tear gas canisters, as you know, were basically being used like bullets right up against people's faces to actually make sure that and particularly again their eyes and face, that they actually were blinded in some cases. In this case, he was blinded by one eye, but also the suffocation that happened with tear gas, and the investigation of the use of tear gas in the North of Ireland proved that basically it was illegal what they were actually doing and using the system there. But he was beaten by the security forces and lay bleeding for some hours on the floor. Despite the gravity of his injury and being denied treatment, and instead found himself interrogated by officers in uniform as well as those in plain clothes. And this corresponds very much to what happened in Ireland, both in recent times and in previous times. Unfortunately, Mohammed actually did lose the sight of one eye, left eye, but however, with the help of Irish and Bahraini activists, eventually Mohammed was flown to Dublin in Ireland and received the necessary treatment to ensure that he did not lose the sight of his right eye as well. And so it's a good example of the solidarity, Bahraini and Irish solidarity, which brought the people together who shared the experiences of the ill treatment, of brutality and torture by the British government or by similar structures across the world, especially against such a vicious regime as Bahraini administration at the present time. The fact that the British state has always been willing to ignore such brutality here in Ireland, and the same with yourselves in Bahrain, I think the correspondence between the two things. I hope that we continue the cooperation and endeavour to actually bring together those nations who suffered in this particular way, so that we can assist each other in trying to expose and bring these cases to the light of the world. And that is what internationalism is about coming together in former colonies and former structures where the British either divided and conquered with partition and various different things, but in lines to actually bring about a peace process. We have been lucky in one sense that we did come out of the conflict with the Irish peace process, which has facilitated a peaceful and democratic avenue forward. But it has been delayed. The British have failed to bring about the issue of a poll which would allow the people of the north of Ireland to decide that they want to live in Ireland, at an all united Ireland, or whether they want to be under British rule. And that has been denied, and to such extent that the Good Friday Agreement has been compromised in that way. But I do hope that you find a similar path forward, that we can actually come together, and future times when we can meet in the one room, that we can actually join our forces together to make sure that the struggling people around the world have a voice in the democratic society. So thank you very much. I'm sorry once again that I can't stay for the full discussion, but I will be here for some time. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore, for your intervention. Especially thank you for the comparison between events in Ireland and in Bahrain. That's something at least I know I wouldn't have thought. It is clear that when history, if it doesn't repeat, at least it echoes. And I think it's a very important perspective there. Thank you very much. I'm now going to give way to our first speaker, who is Professor Mark Owen Jones, who is an assistant professor of Middle East Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. His lectures and research focus on political repression and informational control strategies. He has written multiple publications on disinformation and the digital paradigm of social activism. His most recent work is Political Repression in Bahrain, which gave a comprehensive historical analysis of political repression in Bahrain. He's also soon to publish the Disinformation and Deception in the Middle East, which will be available in February 2022. Thank you, Mark, for being here with us.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's obviously great to be here and an honor to be here, speaking to all of you and speaking about Bahraini martyrs. As Luis said, I've worked on political repression in Bahrain, the history of it, and much of my focus has been on the international dynamics of political repression in Bahrain. So Bahrain, being a small state, has often depended on outside protection from countries, historically the UK and the US, and now to a greater extent, Saudi Arabia. And this is what's so key about those who are killed in the course of political protests in Bahrain, is the international dynamic. So just to give a recent example, and then I'll give a bit of historical context again before the talks. But this is a very obvious example. When Trump was elected, we saw a sudden spike in those who were killed extrajudicially, whether on a boat or actually executed officially. And this is not a coincidence. We know for a fact that the human rights situation in the Gulf more broadly, but particularly in Bahrain, is dependent very much on the kind of pressure that the government of Bahrain feels that they're going to receive from its allies, such as the US, such as the UK. So the very fact that Trump was elected and that Trump had this, this policy towards Iran, it meant that the Bahraini government could easily just accuse anyone in Bahrain of political dissent, accuse them of being Iranian sponsored, and that would be sufficient not to receive blowback from the US. Obviously, this followed the Obama administration, who was more vocal about human rights in the Gulf. And the fact that there was no official executions between 2011 and until Trump was elected also highlights the fact that the Bahrainis were unwilling to do executions when Obama was president. So I just want to start with that sort of more recent example of how external relationships shape the nature of political repression in Bahrain. But I also want to talk a bit about the development of extrajudicial killings and martyrdom in Bahrain, right? So I think one of the most interesting things is we see a sudden increase in deaths in detention by torture post-independence in 1971. So the recorded cases of actual killings in detention were actually a lot lower or non-existent or very hard to come by prior to 1971. Torture did occur, police brutality did occur, and deaths, extrajudicial killings by the police did occur, and especially in 1956, 1954. But killing as a result of torture in prison was something that actually started to go up in 1971. And crucially, before the Iranian Revolution in 1979, a lot of people like to blame the Iranian Revolution on, you know, the government like to use that as a justification for their securitization of opposition, saying, oh, we were worried about Iranian intervention, therefore we just clamped down more on security. This is not true at all. And it's very interesting, again, the relationship that the British might have had with those killings. So in 1971, and actually from 1965, the British recruited Ian Henderson from Kenya, who was known for putting down the Mau Mau uprisings. His methodology was known to be recruiting locals who spoke a language to infiltrate organizations in Bahrain. And so we know that the security forces in Bahrain penetrated most opposition organizations from that point on. But we also know that that surveillance role was also one of the reasons that kept some people out of prison. What happened, though, in 1971 really is that the Prime Minister of Bahrain, who's now passed away, became more in charge of affairs. And under his rule, he was very deliberate in trying to have a more hardline approach against opposition. So what we saw is, again, people being incarcerated and political opposition not being tolerated. I think what's very interesting, though, is the British were very aware of these roles. And so we do have evidence as well that Ian Henderson was personally involved in torture. We have reports of that. But I think what's really crucial and in terms of activism and in terms of accountability is actually the role the British played in preventing British Parliament having knowledge of these affairs in Bahraini prisons. So to cite an interesting example, in 1976, I believe it was 1976, a newspaper editor, Abdullah al-Madani, was murdered. The death was blamed on the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Oman and the Arabian Gulf. However, the trial was widely criticized to be flawed. It was held in camera. At the time, I think a Guardian journalist was prevented from going there. Even British officials in Bahrain noted that those on trial, or at least one of them, was probably not capable of standing trial, and that they expressed their doubts about that. The British also knew, for example, that one of the people arrested for the murder was tortured to death by the Bahrain Defense Force in prison, right? And this was only became public, well, as far as I know, I don't know when I blogged about it a few years ago, but because the National Archives released this document that records it, and Britain acknowledged the reason they did not tell British Parliament this was that because it was a Bahraini state secret. And what's also interesting is that at the time, a group in London of Bahraini activists were actually writing to British officials with saying that we believe that Said al-Awnanati was killed in prison, and Mohammed Bashiri was also killed in custody. And then the British, in a series of edited and edited responses, basically denied knowing that they knew that these people were killed and tortured in custody because they didn't want to compromise the relationship with Bahrainis. So in this example, Britain are deliberately withholding information about the killing of Bahraini citizens from British Parliament on the pretext that they didn't want to upset the Bahrainis. But you have to bear in mind that with the British personnel in Bahrain's security apparatus playing such a big role, they were also trying to protect themselves from significant blowback about this. And I think this is really the start of, continuation of a very toxic relationship in which the UK have often contributed in some way to a lack of accountability about torture and the killing of Bahraini citizens. And we can talk about other examples, but I'll move forward a bit in time because I think it's an interesting point to start. To obviously 2011, when Bahrain, in order to basically show the international community, or at least give the illusion that they were trying to hold police personnel and the security personnel accountable for what were systemic violations of human rights, including extrajudicial killings and torture. They had the BICI report. And the BCI report obviously had a reputable and respectable board of international legal experts who wrote up this important report, an important document. However, that report was largely used to whitewash human rights abuses in Bahrain. It was, again, used to show the public and the international community that Bahrain were committed to actually reforming the police. And in this, they used, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, John Yates. He came over following the BICA report to, quote unquote, reform the police. And the idea, this term reform is used as a proxy for, it's used instead of actual accountability, because of those arguments often that mistakes were made, it was nobody's fault, really. We just need to change things, and that change will be sufficient to kind of move things forward. When in fact, obviously, what most Bahrainis have been calling for decades is not just about democracy, but it's about accountability for those in the security forces and in the government who have been responsible for actually engaging in extrajudicial killings, torture of Bahraini citizens. So that's really important to note. And I think, there's no huge sign of change. I mean, British policy towards Bahrain from Bahrain's independence in 1971 have always been about prioritization of trade and trade relationships and strategic relationships. So the UK really aren't going to compromise any sort of beneficial economic relationship with Bahrain for the sake of human rights. And I think this is why continued pressure on British parliamentaries is important, because the government themselves are not going to do this on their own volition. I mean, back in 2012, I think it was, I even took the Foreign Office to court to get access to a document from the 70s that showed a conversation between Ian Henderson, who I'd mentioned before, who was head of police and accused of torturing Bahrainis. I took the FCO to court because they refused to release or redact or unredact a document from over 40 years ago, where Ian Henderson was talking about the inner workings of the Bahraini police. So even now we can see that the Foreign Office are keen to, and the justification they gave for not releasing the information was because they didn't want to prejudice their relationship with Bahrain. So even now we can see that the British are committed to kind of protecting relationship, even if that involves having documents from over 40 years ago. So I think that's important. I've also, there was a metropolitan investigation into Ian Henderson that was called off citing lack of evidence. What's very interesting about that as well is that I did a Freedom of Information request for the evidence that the Metropolitan Police had acquired to deliver to the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, because the Metropolitan Police argued that the CPS had said there wasn't sufficient evidence for prosecution. So I asked to see what the evidence was, and while initially one of the people who worked in the Metropolitan Police said, we have 10 boxes of evidence, which they still do apparently in a room, it would take too much time to go through it that would exceed the requirements of the Freedom of Information laws. So I was cheeky, and then I said, well, actually, okay, Jen, just do the amount that would be allowed under those information laws, and you can randomly pick a box. Initially, they said, yes, they would do that, and then suddenly they overturned that decision and said, no, we can't do that, and then accused me of being vexatious. So I thought that was quite ironic. But I think, apart from showing this difficult relationship, there are these strategies. We know that, for example, if people have the resources, they could do more of these freedom of information requests. They could ask more about what the British government knew, for example, about Ian Henderson. There are avenues, I think, of accountability. I mean, the good thing about these court cases and whatnot, again, it just, you get press coverage and it puts a little more pressure on the British government. Whether or not you think that's beneficial is a different question entirely. But yeah, it's a difficult road. So I would, sum up my argument by saying, and perhaps to no one's surprise, that the British government have, and for various reasons, hidden and obstructed the accountability that Bahrainis have of extrajudicial killings and torture, and that's been going on for some time. And I'm sure Stacey as well will attest to that. And so, yeah, thank you. That's all I want to say. Obviously, I'm happy to answer questions further down the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for your illuminating contribution. It was quite interesting to hear about the British role in the practice. Quite worrying as well. Before continuing with other valuable insights of the remaining panelists, we want to show you a video containing a poem by Adel Ali on the fight for human rights and democracy in Bahrain.
Apologies.
All your armies, all your fighters, all your tanks, and all your soldiers against the boy, holding a stone, standing there, all alone. In his eyes, I see the sun. In his smile, I see the moon. Wonder, I only wonder, who is weak and who is strong, who is right and who is wrong. And I only wish that the truth has a tongue.
We wanted to show you this so you could perhaps find a sense of meaning in the fight for human rights and democracy in Bahrain. Over to you, Luis.
Thank you, Maciek. We now continue with our next panelist, which would be Rodney Shakespeare. Now, Rodney Shakespeare is a lecturer, paper presenter, and co-founder of the Global Justice Movement. Rodney has taught for years in the UK schools and colleges, specializing in binary economics and Islamic economics and finance. He is the author of a number of books. His most popular co-authored monograph, Binary Economics, The New Paradigm, which examines the growth in productive capacity and total economic output in industrial economies. He is currently chair of the Committee Against Torture in Bahrain. We are grateful for having you today with us.
Chair, a word about the Committee Against Torture in Bahrain. It consists of all those people who collect statements, videos, photographs, and indeed other evidence of torture and killing in Bahrain. That evidence is not in any one particular spot. It's too dangerous to do that, but it exists in various spots, and the time will come when that evidence is used to prosecute criminal prosecutions against hundreds of members of the killer Khalifa regime in Bahrain. A quick preliminary word, and then a bit of hope. The preliminary word is that don't accept the argument that British economic interests are the best and what are the true reason for the maintenance of the regime. The true economics of the British people are to trade with the people of Bahrain who've been liberated. Get rid of the killer Khalifas, and the Bahraini people will be trading left, right, and center with the UK. Now, is there any hope? On the face of it, no. But remember this. The Middle East, or rather West Asia, and that is a significant change of language. The West Asia region is full of medieval, autocratic, totalitarian regimes. They are basically fundamentally unstable. And at this moment, there could be approaching a time of incredible instability. You see, if you look at the negotiations going on about the Iran nuclear agreement, Nobody in their right mind could trust an American signature on anything. And therefore, I think it's very likely that there will be no agreement. In which case, the chances then rise because Israel will make an attack. Now, if it makes an attack, Iran will strike back. And in practice, even though these regimes will claim, oh, it wasn't us, because they host American bases, because of the complexity and of the way the attack will be done, over whose land, etc., etc., it is certain that West Asia will go up in flames. And in those circumstances, anything can happen anywhere in that region. So I stop there. I just say to everybody watching, and pass the word on, you collect the evidence, and one day it will be used against these killers and these torturers. Secondly, the case for a revolution in Bahrain is ultimately, it's economic, just as much as it's moral and political, but don't forget the economic one. And lastly, don't give up hope. The Zionists are quite capable of precipitating a situation in which there could be massive change throughout the whole region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shakespeare, for your interesting perspective and for maybe a gloomy word and a word of hope at the same time. We'll move now to the next speaker, Agnes Bofano. She works as Research and Policy Associate at the Bahraini Institute for Rights and Democracy, a non-profit organization that attempts to raise awareness for the cause of democracy and human rights in Bahrain. Thank you for your work, Agnes, and for accepting to speak with us today. I'm afraid you're muted.
The microphone is muted. Unmute.
Still, we can't hear you. I'm sorry, Agnes.
It's still muted. The microphone is muted.
Would you like to maybe reconnect? Maybe that would maybe do the trick.
Bottom left of the screen. Unmute.
No.
You are unmuted, but still your voice is not coming.
We hope Agnes will be able to come back with us in a second. Should we continue with the event, Lewis? If you could move on to the next speaker.
Okay, so our next speaker would be Professor. Well, hold on. I just saw that Agnes is asking to enter. Let's just give her a last chance. Okay. Can you speak, Agnes? Okay, in that case, while we give Agnes the help to, time to fix her audio, we are going to move to our next speaker. Our next speaker this afternoon would be Professor Stacy Strobel, who is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at Shenandoah University. Her areas of interest stretch from criminal justice to Middle Eastern studies, combining the two with numerous publications on repression in Bahrain. Her most recent monograph, sectarian order in Bahrain draws connection between sectarianism and the rise of colonial criminal justice. Her most recent publication, Was There a Bahraini Genocide?, reconsiders sectarian violence in the 1920s, building upon her previous research. Thank you, Stacy, for accepting our invitation to speak today.
Thank you so much for having me. The poem video was very moving, so I feel a little bit of heaviness in my heart with that line that we hope that the truth has a tongue. Really, really beautiful. Quick story before I start. About almost a year ago, last spring, I attempted to organize an ECOSOC side panel on the death penalty and extrajudicial killings under the umbrella of the American Society of Criminology, which is my professional organization, academic professional organization, and also Salam DHR, another human rights organization focusing on Bahrain. And it did not get accepted. And it did not get accepted because it specifically mentioned Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. And those member states, along with a couple other, blocked our event. And so I am going to try again this year with a vaguer abstract, if you will. But I start this out by saying how important it is that we have forums like this, particularly on a day of martyrs. The narrative is so important about the repression and oppression, the lack of civil and human rights in Bahrain. We can't stop talking about this because my government, the UK government, their powers simply aren't having this conversation about what we're dealing with. And so we need to keep this conversation alive, whether through poetry or scholarship or activism. So we know that when looking at killings in Bahrain by the state, we really have two pieces here. We have the extrajudicial killings, which I think Mark gave a really wonderful history in a short time. It's very difficult to do because there's a lot there. He did a great job. And so we have that extrajudicial killings piece. And what I would actually call that, borrowing from an American, African-American race and criminal justice scholar, Dr. Dolores Brown, she always called the extrajudicial killings in our country as an unofficial death penalty, often because it has to do with stigmatization and directed at a certain group. And so I like that notion of an unofficial death penalty. I think it's an important way of framing police violence against citizens and torture that unfortunately leads to illness and death in prisons or in detention. The second piece, and I think what I'm going to focus on a little bit, but the two are connected, are what I'm calling problematic judicial killings that are, the official death penalty in Bahrain, but of course are without due process, are completely discriminatory in nature, and are directed at opposition figures and activists, Shia, and indigenous Bahraina in particular. And these two things are connected. We often look at, particularly the media focus, but when there's an event with a fatality in Bahrain, we sort of look at the discrete event. But what I'm sort of learning from taking a closer eye to some of these events is that we really have a situation where the extrajudicial and the judicial are involved in a cycle, what I'm calling a cycle of brutality. And a brutality hypothesis around the death penalty is sort of a classic in American criminal justice. And it basically says that states who use the death penalty are actually sort of subtly signaling that killing is a part of the society. It's sort of putting a star on the notion of violence, as a means of order. And in the American context where this comes out of it, the argument is complicated. The argument's not so complicated if we talk about a brutality hypothesis in Bahrain. We can see a direct connection between the death penalty being given out and then protests, which then lead to extrajudicial killings, and in a cycle within this repressive context. So a good example is the unfortunate death of Mohammed Ibrahim al-Muqtad, only 22 years old, who was out in the streets in Balad al-Qadam in July 2019. He was protesting the execution of, or he may or may not have been protesting. He was out there in the crowd who were protesting the execution of Ali al-Arab and Ahmed al-Malali. And so he was inhaled some gas from the forces that responded to the protesters and subsequently died. The official authority version of this death was that he had an illness and died. So there was no state responsibility for the fact that it was police violence. But what brought him out was this protest of this, judicial, I'll call it problematically judicial death penalty case, where these two individuals were given the label of terrorists, which we know is overused as a label, and then used within the criminal justice, because terrorism has a death penalty. Once you can attach that label, it's quite easy to move towards a death penalty. But the evidence against these two who were ultimately killed was likely, the evidence is strong, that there was torture and that there were a series of false confessions that had to do with the original terror plot. There was also alleged that they were involved in a Joe prison escape a couple of years earlier. There was quite a lot going on there. But suffice it to say, the layers of state violence against these people and the ripple effect of it is really this cycle of brutality. And so it's really important to link these events together in the narrative, because you can see that the rule of law, in quotes, killings, and those that are happening in the streets are really the same conflict and the same state violence, and I'm going to argue the same state crime. Now, after the death of this young man in July 2019, there was some pressure on Bahrain to say something. And the Bahrain embassy in DC a few days later said, and this sort of resonates with what Mark was saying, said that just as capital punishment is permitted in the United States, the Kingdom of Bahrain allows judges to impose death penalties in cases of serious crime. So thinking of the sort of death penalty as an abolitionist movement that would benefit from being global, as the UN has taken on, and other entities, is really, really important. This also goes back to what Mark said about the allies turning in the other way. Here, this gives Bahrain some kind of moral authority to continue this state violence under the tacit acceptance of the United States, maybe not so tacit. So we know that in Bahrain, the death penalty is much more expansive than it is in the United States. As a comparison, in the United States, the death penalty is only used for murder that's with aggravated circumstances. Of course, we still use it an awful lot, and for that I am very sad. But in Bahrain, many other crimes qualify for the death penalty, including non-lethal crimes, being the ringleader of an armed gang, whatever that means, apostasy, even drug trafficking since 2018 is got the death penalty. But of course, this label of terrorism, which also carries the death penalty, is really where the government is hanging its hat. And it is very much, as Mark said, about sort of painting this false, overblown sort of pro-Iranian type plots that people who are actually just looking for their nation-based civil rights, right, are being linked to these so-called international actors of state violence. So it's really quite a trumped up situation. We see the politicization of civil rights activity being reframed as this pro-Iranian terrorism and then being eligible for the death penalty. We've had 51 death sentences since 2011. This is a six-fold increase since before the 7-year moratorium. So many of them, as many of your organizations have documented and your scholarship, are the result of false confessions and torture. The evidence is just simply not to be relied upon because of that. And in fact, the whole system potentially is based on torture. Furthermore, the means of the death penalty is also considered by international standards to be particularly brutal. It's the use of the firing squad, which is in official death penalties almost never used anymore. And so we see all of this cycle of brutality. All of this is a big package of a mess. And criminologists would really take a look at this from the point of view of state crime. And so when I was trying to put together that ECOSOC side panel, I was trying to sort of make my discipline of criminal justice a little bit more relevant to what is so important about what's going on in Middle Eastern studies, Bahrain studies, and so on. Because we have a ton of state crime scholars that are working in my field, but not focused enough on a place like Bahrain. And I think that there is some really important reasons to take a look at what's going on in Bahrain as state crime, which is really the hallmark of a sort of perspective called critical criminology. And Penny Green and Tori Ward, two criminologists who've written a lot on state crime, have defined it as organizational deviance by the state agencies that violate human rights. And they put together both an essentialist and a sort of constructionist piece. The essentialist piece being that there's a moral impetus here to be concerned. The constructionist piece is much more about these killings being seen as harmful by an important public, including civil society actors. What's really, really interesting is a very famous criminologist, Robert Agnew, talks about state crime as actually not necessarily needing its own category because the state is committing so-called core crimes that you would associate with street violence, murder, rape, assault. I mean, it's fair to say the Al Khalifa are just murderers from a criminal justice point of view. Maybe we don't need fancy state crime theories. But Agnew goes on to say some interesting things about how we know state crime, in addition to it just having the core crimes that we might be worried about if it were happening in the streets, that there is significant blameworthiness and also public condemnation, right? And so we have all these figures, all these factors. In addition, we have some general explanatory themes in state crime that are also happening in Bahrain. We have, so state crime theorists have often said that this is more likely to happen in cultural contexts where identity, the official sort of nation state identity is monolithic. So I think we have that with the kind of Sunni hegemony that goes on that the Al Khalifa clearly nurture. That we also have a sense of trained brutality. And absolutely, starting with at least probably earlier, we could take a look at that, but at least in what Mark was talking about in the early 1970s with Ian Henderson, there is much evidence that he has uncovered that I have been able to learn in conversations with police officers, that some of this torturous detention type police behavior is trained in, and particularly if you're in a special forces deployment, in certain other riot control deployments, that the training actually comes out of this the institutionalization of these sort of draconian measures that really start with Ian Henderson and some other British officers that, and it could be, again, it's a little bit opaque as to whether there's some hybridity there, whether there's sort of a Bahraini version of brutality that merged with the British version, if you will. And we have this sort of hybrid thing, but it's being carried in these institutions to this day. So we're not dealing with something like individual bad actors. We're dealing with a structural, institutional problem that is being learned as one enters the police. We also have the general theme of techniques of neutralization or rationalization, again, where the state has, fancy discourse in order to show why it was necessary to do a unwarranted home invasion arrest of, an activist in the middle of the night, or why it needs to hand the death penalty out for certain others. So that's in spades. And also that state crime theorists also say that there's often a strategic geopolitical interest that's being privileged over solving the nation state or more local internal problem. And of course we see that. And I've been looking a little bit more at the spatial dynamics of some of where we're seeing state violence in Bahrain. And I'm still sort of working on some of the data, which is a mess. But it does seem like we can definitely locate more police violence within historic Baharna villages throughout the island, that the police respond to many different things, but they are more likely to be brutal when entering in those sort of ghettoized spaces. And so I'm kind of working on that. So stay tuned for that for me in the future, if I can pull that together. But long story short, all of this is a giant package of state crime, which is clearly starting to, I think, I'm very hopeful in one sense. I do think that the narrative that we are putting forth here in this particular form is being a little bit better heard than 10 years ago, perhaps, in terms of condemnation about these kinds of extrajudicial and poor death penalty decisions by the European Parliament, the French Parliament, the UN Special Rapporteur on Arbitrary Execution. So there's a little bit more. But like Rodney, I'm very, very disturbed by the trajectory since the Arab Spring. It only seems to be getting worse. And it seems to be more hopeless. When I talk to Bahrainis, there's a sense of dread. The repression is sort of working right now because of all of this state violence. So we're in a really sort of difficult situation altogether to try to keep up hope, keep this conversation alive, to see if we can potentially raise enough awareness that the powers that may be able to make a dent in this suddenly, hopefully, will begin to pay attention, because certainly this is key to all sorts of global frameworks, not the least Sustainable Development Goal number 16 of the UN, which talks about promoting the rule of law, the national level. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I thank you all for taking some time to be at this forum, and please, everyone, continue your good work. We are changing the conversation slowly, and thank you.
Thank you. Many thanks for this, Stacey, for your fascinating presentation. Let's hope that the vicious cycle, so to speak, will finally come to an end. Let's give it another go, me, Agnesi. Maybe this time around it will work fine. Again, a short introduction. Research and Policy Associate at the Bahraini Institute for Rights and Democracy, BIRD, a non-profit organization that attempts to raise awareness for the cause of democracy and human rights in Bahrain. Thank you, Agnesi, for taking the time, and the floor is all yours.
Hello, can you hear me all right now? Amazing. I apologize for the technical issues before. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for organizing. Unable to attend today, so I will be taking your place in speaking on the UK role in Bahrain's extrajudicial killings. So I apologize if anything is unclear, but hopefully you can hear me. So at BIRD, we've been working quite closely with British parliamentarians to scrutinize the UK government's, as Mark rightly described it earlier, toxic relationship with Bahrain. According to BIRD's research, there are currently 26 individuals on death row in Bahrain. 12 are sentenced on political charges, 11 alleged torture, and all of them have exhausted legal recourse and are at imminent risk of execution. This means that they could be executed at any given day with little or no warning to either themselves or their families. In June this year, Bird co-published a report with the charity Reprieve, which revealed that since the Arab Spring in 2011, there has been a 600% rise in death sentences. In July 2019, the then UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, Agnes Callamard, appealed to stop the execution of 3 individuals who had been convicted of alleged terrorism charges. But just hours after, Ali Al-Arab and Ahmed Al-Malali were put to death by firing squad. Ms. Callamard later condemned the execution, saying that because their confessions were taken on the torture, they constituted arbitrary killings. Despite this sort of international condemnation, the UK continues to have a strong historic friendship with Bahrain. We have schemes like the Gulf Strategy Fund, or GSF, and the Integrated Activity Fund, or IAF, which are allegedly aimed at strengthening, deepening, and broadening the UK's engagement with the 6 GCC states in order to increase regional stability and mutual security. But in reality, the UK's continued adoption of a policy of engagement with Bahrain through the form of such technical assistance have enabled internationally discredited Bahraini institutions like, for example, the Ministry of Interior Ombudsman, to receive funding to carry out the same abuses that the UK is supposedly aiming to tackle. So the UK also has a close partnership with Bahrain's oversight bodies. For example, we know that the UK College of Policing has provided training to Bahrain's Special Investigations Unit, which means that the UK taxpayer money is effectively being used to train the same Bahraini officials responsible for covering up human rights abuses and torture of political prisoners. And just recently, in July this year, a parliamentary report revealed that the UK government had channeled over £53 million to Gulf regimes in a secretive funding scheme backed by the IAF. And one of the problems with such schemes is its absolute minimum levels of accountability, transparency, and due diligence. Because whilst the government recognizes that challenges do remain, they maintain that, and I quote, consistent positive steps are being made on security and justice reform in Bahrain. Nevertheless, they refuse to disclose the beneficiaries of technical assistance. So the government has continued to emphasize that the IAF and GSF funding is not being used to fund or sponsor Bahraini bodies dealing with security matters, but then they justify withholding information based on the blanket exception of the Freedom of Information Act regarding matters pertaining to national security. So no matter how many times organizations, diplomats, activists, torture victims, and former detainees call on governments like the UK to prioritize human rights over political alliances with authoritarian regimes like Bahrain, it's extremely frustrating and extremely concerning to see how governments, not only in the UK, but in Europe and the US too, continue to praise the same not so independent bodies that have been widely connected to human rights abuses. And today we're 10 years on from the 2011 protests, we're 27 years on from the first 2 martyrs of the 1990s uprising, Hani Khamis and Hani al-Wasti. And yet we see more extrajudicial killings, we see more imprisonment, and we see more torture. And on the other hand, we see less accountability from Bahrain and less public pressure exerted on them by the UK. And just because everyone ended kind of on a positive note, I would also like to take this opportunity to raise the case of Ali Mishaima, who has been on a sit-in outside the Bahraini embassy in London and on a hunger strike for 22 days today. I believe he is holding a press conference just now in solidarity with his imprisoned father and opposition leader, as you may know, Hassan Mishaima, and as well as Dr. Abdul Jalil al-Singais, who, as we all know, has been on a hunger strike for over 160 days now. So thank you very much again for this event, and thank you to all the panelists as well.
Thank you, Agnes, for your time and your insights, especially for your insights on the intervention of the UK's involvement in death penalty causes in Bahrain, as well as extrajudicial killings. I think it's certainly disappointing that a country such as the United Kingdom, that historically has been a champion of human rights, does not extend its own values to the people of Bahrain. But at last, we only get to fight and to change the conversation, to bring media attention to this fact. With that being said, over to you, Maciek.
Thank you. So now we would like to show you something important, namely the testimonies of the martyrs' mothers on the suffering of their children inflicted under the Bahraini authorities. We have contacted a number of family members who lost their families, their relatives through violence from the Bahraini security forces, but they refused to participate in this event out of fear from the Bahraini authorities. I hope that this video will at least act as a worthy replacement to their testimonies.
حول الإسلام قدمنا أولادنا وهذا رفعة وعز وشرف إلينا. نال وسام الشرف الشهادة بين ولد ألف رضا ألف رضا ورضا قائد كابوس على صدور المطاولات. ما رأيت الناس من ضحيتي وانتهيتي لحسين أربعة يما طنيت على يما طنيت
Thank you, Louis. So we hope that this video at least can partly illustrate the suffering. These people have faces. These people are real people, and the dictatorship is taking its hold on that. Now we would like Dr. Saeed Al-Shahabi to take a minute to present a statement on the Bahraini martyrs. Dr. Saeed, I'm afraid you're muted.
Dr. Saeed.
Thank you, Maciek. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, all of you. You have done a wonderful job. Mark, Rodney, all our friends have been, sorry, and Stacy, and of course, our friend from Bern, Agnes. I don't know why they pronounce your name, so, not Agnes, I don't know. Somebody was saying, Sayyid Ahmed was saying it in a different way. Anyway, it is, we can see you, we heard you. Thank you for your thoughts. As for the what we have seen, the videos of the martyrs' mothers, they are all steadfasting. They are steadfast. They are strong in their position. None of them showed well, any sign of fatigue. Of course, internally they are devastated to lose their children, but at the same time they are showing brave face. One of them is saying that if I had 1,000 of Rida is the name of her son who was killed by a police bullets. She said, I am ready to sacrifice 1,000 Ridas, 1,000 of her sons for the cause, because it is for us to imagine how much pain these women have been under before their sons are killed. That makes the killing of their sons an easier task for them, because the pain they were suffering is so much because of the regime's oppression and repression. So on this Martyrs' Day, I stand in honoring them, and also I stand in appreciation of those young men and women who went forward and sacrificed themselves. The aim is clear. We want freedom. We want dignity. We want, of course, security and stability of our country. It is the regime that is bringing foreign forces and foreign armies to invade the country, not these people. So what we saw, it's only a glimpse of what is going on inside the minds and hearts of these women, but also the passion with which our speakers today spoke gives me hope that we are not alone. Our people are not alone. There are people with the human feelings, with the human touch, with the human compassion, and that is what keeps us going. Without this passion, compassion, support, high moral grounds, with all this, we find fuel in the machine of change that we are driving. And I hope you continue to support our people. And thank you all for standing by our people today. And thanks to the mothers of the martyrs. And may God bless the souls of all those who have fallen in the path of peace and security and freedom, whether in Bahrain or anywhere else. So with these words, I'd like to thank you. And you have spent more than 1 hour. So God bless you. I wish you a happy Christmas, a happy New Year, and please keep safe and protect yourself against the pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Said, for your continued work. And I just realized I forgot to introduce you, but I don't think you need an introduction.
You don't.
I think that is fine. We open now the chat box for the questions. So if you have any questions that one of our panelists, please pose them right now. And I'll give Lewis the voice just to briefly conclude the panel section.
Can I ask Stacy a question, please?
If we could have first
Lewis's,
yes, conclude the statement,
sure.
and
Go ahead.
You would be first up.
We're going to conclude real quick, Dr. Said, and then we'll give way to the Q&A. I just wanted to say real quick that it comes as no surprise to anyone listening that extrajudicial killings are still a reality in Bahrain. Then our panelists have helped cast light on the specific practices taking place in this totalitarian state. And of course, however, I think the truth is seen and rarely heard. So that is why it was so important that everyone present had the opportunity to see the faces behind these human rights violations through the victims' mothers. Because of course, we can speak about all of this all the time and how important it is. We can give a lot of academic digression, but I think it's very important to see the people that are behind everything that's happening. And without further ado, I now give the floor to Maciek for Q&A.
So as promised, Dr. Said, you may ask the first question.
No, I think there are 2 written questions, so please go ahead with them.
Sure, okay. Okay then, so first question to Professor Stacey Strobel. Can we link Bahrain's criminal justice system and its contemporary policy of repression to Bahrain's colonial history?
Yes. That's essentially what my book was about. And I think we can do that. It's not entirely that though. I point to sort of 2 pieces, 2 historical disruptions, as I call them. The Al Khalifa conquest in the 1780s is one layer of subjugation that begins, and then the British layer of subjugation is on top of that. So I think that's part of the reason why there's so many complexities. There are so many sort of powers and cultures and colliding, so many identities to unpack in Bahrain. But at the end of the day, there were 2 big pieces that sort of set the stage in my reading of the history. The Al Khalifa were colonists of their, in their own right, coming out of the Arab interior. And so in a way, we could see this as a kind of double colonization. Absolutely.
Thank you, Stacey. Another question for Mark here. Could the British government ever be held accountable for the role in prevention of declaring human rights abuses, especially as they are signatories of human rights legal frameworks?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really great question. Obviously, I'm not a legal expert, but for my research, there are various mechanisms for holding accountable it would be officials. So in theory, like the case against Ian Henderson could have been brought, but the government, well, the Metropolitan Police said they just didn't have enough evidence. So I think when you have any situation like this, you're going to run into a political argument where certain people will be insulated from accountability within the UK. I think going back to the 70s as well, there were signatories, and I think some of those, some of those incidents that now we now know about, thanks to the release of historical documents, could probably fall under that. But I think the statute of limitations or the Britain's signatory to those things would have come after that. So I don't know how those historical cases would go down. But I certainly think in contemporary examples, if you have British citizens working in Bahrain, they can in theory be held accountable. But again, those prosecutions would likely be led privately. And again, there would be a lot of political obstruction to try and get them to happen. But it's theoretically very possible, yes, especially when they've been involved or believed to have been involved in acts of torture or things that might have resulted in torture or any sort of violation of human rights. So it's a good but usually expensive avenue to go down.
Thank you, Mark. If we could have Dr. Said, your question now, that would be great. I'm afraid you're on mute.
First to Professor Shakespeare, how much do we expect, how much can we expect from the British government in the near future to a little bit change their political support, unwavering support to the regime? And what can we do in order to influence such a change? And Agnes, you have been following the case of Dr. Abdelaziz Singais and so impunity. Why is it such a marginalized concept in international politics? How can killers go around unscathed, as we saw with Mohammed bin Salman, and now, of course, many killers in Bahrain who come and go at leisure? Thank you.
The first part of that question is most important. Everybody on this panel is horrified by the moral aspect, the torturing and the killing. But horror at torture and killing is not going to change the policy of the British government, because they say, oh, dear boy, this is all about economics, isn't it? And when they put that argument forward, you can raise the moral issues as much as you like, but you won't win the argument. But I wish to point out that when this country has helped revolutions in the past, for example, in South America 200 years ago, the trade then continued for this country in an open, friendly way, almost forevermore. And if within Bahrain itself there's a wider distribution of income, you can guarantee that that will result in a doubling of trade between Bahrain and the UK. And the atmosphere will be much more pleasant. So I would say to Saeed, I am as horrified as anybody as what's going on. And yes, press the moral case. You have to get people to want to act. But the killer argument is this nonsense about it is the economic interests. At the moment, it's the economics of a small group and those who receive gold-plated caskets with maybe a gold coin from it, from the killer Khalifa family, that sort of thing. So my invitation is to everybody, keep going as you are, but it is time to attack the main argument of the British government, which is a totally false argument, because in economics, when you open up the economy to more people, there's more activity and more trade. It's as simple as that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shakespeare. If we could have Agnesi to answer Dr. Said's question, or if you could.
Of course, yes. So your question, Dr. Said, and you're right. My name is Anisa Bil-Arabi, but Anisa in English. Yeah, it's one of the things that we're at Bird we're most frustrated. Why is there no impunity for these governments? And unfortunately, we work with the UK government, and we unfortunately see the UK government reiterating the Bahraini storyline. And for example, with the case of Dr. Abdul Jalil al-Singais, despite continuous FOIs from our side, from MPs, from parliamentarians, they continue to say, things like, we continue to monitor the case, but we trust the independent Ministry of Interior, who claims that Dr. al-Singais has been convicted on terrorism charges. 162 days ago, he entered a hunger strike because Bahraini prison authorities confiscated his research in April this year. And this research has it went through a legal review, and it was determined to be apolitical. And yet Bahraini authorities continue to have that research, which is why Dr. al-Singais hasn't ended his hunger strike. And when organizations like Bird ask the government why they're not holding the Bahraini officials accountable for this, they just continue to reiterate the Bahraini line of things, saying that he was convicted on these charges, and they just there's nothing else that they reply to us. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that, Dr. Said. It's something that we're very frustrated about as well.
Yeah, I apologize again for the name situation. My deepest apologies. If we have one last question, we have here for Rodney Shakespeare. In your view, how far can an economic revolution in Bahrain go over a political one? And if you could have a 2-minute answer, I know it's not possible to do that, but have a comprehensive answer. But if we could fit in 2 minutes, that would be amazing.
I think you said, how would the revolution in Bahrain also be a political one? I think that was the question. But of course, they're connected. The political situation at the moment is fixed, isn't it? It's rigid inside Bahrain, and it's supported by the Americans and the British and the Israelis, all of whom wish to suppress political democracy and also economic democracy right the way throughout the region. So these things are definitely interconnected, as is also the moral issue, the torture and the killing, which you have to look at how are you going to break it. And at the moment, there seem to me to be only 2 ways. You beat the British government in its economic argument, which is false, or there's some sort of overall frankly, political and probably military violence in the first place throughout the region. Bit by bit change is not going to happen. It's not going to happen in Saudi Arabia. It's not going to happen in Iran. And Israel, of course, as soon as there's any sort of major change, will be ending up attacking. So, but the situation is not fixed at this moment. It could suddenly open up, at which point you've got to be ready for the political change. And there are people in London, of course, who are ready for that. Also to welcome what would be the economic opportunity, which would be massive. I mean, I tell you, the people of Bahrain will want to come to spend time in London, support that political revolution, support that economic revolution, and everybody will be wanting to come and do things. And there will be a trade the other way. So perhaps I'm over optimistic, but at the end of the day, you've got to beat the British government in its own argument, which is they claim it's economics. And at the end of the day, there's a bigger economic argument. It's either that or it's that violence which comes from attack by Israel.
Thank you. I must then call it quits here and finish the event here. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you for all the answers. And I give now a floor to Lewis, who's going to give us a little introduction to the possible initiatives that we can do ourselves to fight for human rights and democracy in Bahrain. Over to you, Lewis.
Thank you, Maciek. Again, thank you to everyone who has participated. I would like to say that, of course, if you would like to help or take action, there are things that you can do. For instance, I'm going to give you 2 examples. The first being that something you can do right now is sign the petition for an early day motion to free Dr. Al-Singhais, who has to this day been on hunger strike for 161 days. I want the number to sink in, 161 days of hunger strike. And you can participate via the following link, which we are sharing through chat. Then on a different note, although our panelists have already commented it, another action you can take is show support via Twitter to Ali Musheima, who has been on hunger strike for 22 days to protest against the mistreatment of his father, Dr. Al-Singhais, at the hand of the Bahraini government. You can do this by tweeting to @Musheima under the following hashtags, which we are going to provide via chat as well.
They should be all available for you to click. It would be very much appreciated. To conclude, we are trying to support the fight for human rights and democracy in Bahrain by giving media exposure and to the realities that are happening in this small country, often overlooked by international community and neglected by international media. The support you give by taking these small steps can play a great part in this effort towards a lasting change in Bahrain. We thank again the panelists for their great insights on Bahrain, the participants for their question, for their time in today's event, and over to you, Lewis.
Thank you.
Just to finish with this, I want to say, same as other panelists have done, today we have talked about very serious and grave issues that are happening in this very small country, Bahrain, which might leave us feeling a bit disheartened. But we would like to finish on a more positive note, because even if we think that to this day the progress seems something that is not happening, and the regime seems monolithic and strong, change is in fact possible. It's coming. History again repeats, and when it doesn't repeat, it echoes. Nothing lasts forever, including totalitarian regimes. And to this end, we would like to show you a song by an artist who was in Bahrain when the pro-democracy uprising took place in Pearl Roundabout. And again, it's an upbeat song which will lift your spirits and remind you that change is in fact possible.
Thank you all again for commemorating the Martyrs Day. All the panelists, thank you again. Huge words of thanks for your time and attention. And we hope to see you soon at our next event. And please watch the video. I think it's a good way of getting out this negativity that we have spoken about today. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.